So, man, I've opened a can of worms in this sermon series. I mean, it's been really fascinating to get, daily responses from people in the congregation, a lot of whom just say, I say this all the time. So it's some confession, people saying, you know what, I have come to realize I have been saying this all the time. It is what it is. And I think you're right. I can't give in to that kind of fatalism, but some people sending me funny things as well, cartoons or articles where it is what it is stated. When I got home, Debbie and I were away for a few days, and when I got home, there was a plaque in my office, maybe I'll hang it here next week, from someone in the congregation that says, it is what it is, right? And this is the funniest one, though, of all. I get, while I'm away, I get an email that tells me a story, true story, of what happened here in our congregation. I can't rat out the person involved because this is a great servant of our congregation, but this person happened to be in the building talking with all the construction crews about things that were happening, and one of the many things that has gone not quite right, that is even now as we do this new piece, and there was something that just wasn't going to be right for a while, and it was different than expected, and all of this, and so the person who's a member of our church says to the construction foreman, to the guy who's working for one of the subcontractors, he says to him, well, it is what it is. Unbeknownst to him, this particular construction worker has been watching us since opening day. Every single service, may be watching today. And this person from outside of our congregation says to my congregant, who's been right here in the room hearing these sermons, heard it Easter Sunday, heard it from Chris last week, and this construction worker says to this guy in our church, he says, hey, doesn't your pastor say you're not supposed to say that? He says, your pastor says it's not what it is. And so this member of our congregation says, yeah, you're right, but, I don't listen to our pastor. So that really happened. But, so many cool things there, right? You just don't ever know who's paying attention and who's tuning in. That's the coolest part of the story. But also just to be reminded that sometimes when we hear things for the first time, they're more powerful than when we start to take them for granted. And that's been true for me in these gospel narratives of the signs. I've preached these before. If you've been around long enough, Greg and Kathy, you remember this, but I preached these 7 signs pretty early in my tenure. So when Chris said, hey, I'm kind of interested in this topic, it is not what it is thing that you're having, he said, why don't we look at the 7 signs of John for that? And I said, no, I already preached those. He goes, well, why don't you look back and see when you preached those? 2007. That's when I preached them. He goes, man, nobody, even the people who are here won't remember. You're not that good. So that's why we were able to get back to these. But these signs really are signs that there's a different reality, that it is not what it is. They're not just signs of Jesus' lordship. That's the simple equation. They're signs of what it means that Jesus is Lord, of how the whole reality of these apostles is being changed, the people who are hearing Jesus, and now how our realities are being redefined. We see things through an eternal lens, as I often say, and that's completely different. But, it is hard for us to grasp, even if we're believers, that it is not what it is a lot of the time. And some things do seem to sort of be what they are, right? So, do you ever relish the opportunity to get caught in the middle, stuck in the middle? Is that something you like? I think when we use the term stuck in the middle, or even just the term middle, we mean average at best. So, in where I come from, you would ask a lot of people, how you doing? I don't know, you tell me, did they say this where you grew up? And they say, fairly middling. Have you heard that before? Which means not awful, but not great either. It just is what it is. That's what that means. And so, it's like, I'm just kind of in the middle. I think if you use the term middle age, you almost never use that. Like somebody says, how old are you? You go, I'm middle age. It's like not something that is to be relished. To be the middle child in the family, if you're that, that's a tough place to occupy. I've always noticed watching my brother Lee, who's the middle brother in my family, there's a clear place for the youngest, right? I mean, the youngest is always adored, the playful one. The youngest is the youngest. And the oldest, everybody loves the youngest. And the oldest, everybody hates the oldest, like me. We always have to be in control, have our way, that kind of thing. So, there's a clear role for us. But if you're in the middle, you got to figure it all out. You kind of got to make it up on your own. And you don't want to be like your older sibling, nor do you want to be like your younger one, so you usually wind up being fairly unique, a pretty unique person. And there are strange ways this plays out. But I don't think nobody asked to be a middle child. It just happened that way. And I don't think we ever mean that as positive. And then, there's this. Has this ever happened to you before? Stuck in the middle on the airplane? Right? Oh, man, I hate that. It's the worst. For me, it's the worst anyway. I mean, so if I go to, I don't usually go to the check-in counter, but I look on my phone, and it tells me that I've been moved, or the seat assignments have happened a different way than I thought, or whatever the case, and I find myself in the middle of the plane, in the middle of the row. I'm like, oh, that's terrible. I'll do anything I can to try to move from that. Debbie and I, we fly together a lot. We've traveled a lot together. And, back in our early honeymoon years, we'd always fly together on one side of the plane, cuddle the whole way. You know how it goes. And, back then, if we were leaving our kids behind, that time was precious. We're empty nesters now. There's plenty of time to cuddle. Debbie's like, get us seats across the aisle from each other. We'll occasionally look at each other so that we know we're there. But other than that, each of us will get in our own zone. And I go, well, honey, why don't I just stick you over here beside me? And she goes, okay, I'll sit on the outside. Okay, I'll put you across. And she goes, what I hate is waking up in the middle of the night on a flight to Europe or something, and I got to go to the restroom, and I got to get across all these people. I don't like that. I don't like being in the middle. So put us on the opposite sides of the road. So sometimes the companies, they'll move us together. And I'll have to go to the desk and say, hey, I put us where I want us. They said, but you're flying together. I didn't tell my wife that. Okay, this doesn't work. Okay, but I read an article in the Washington Post. You can go read it yourself. That the middle seat is the more desirable seat. That's what this person said. That this is where you actually want to be. And one of the things that this person, she pointed out, is that's the safest place on the plane. I'm like, look. When a plane falls out of the sky, how many survivors are there usually? I mean, generally speaking, none. So sometimes someone may make it. It's a pretty rare deal. I'd rather be comfortable going down. That's how I feel. So I don't like to be in the middle. But you know what? That's not really true of everything. I mean, when we talk about the middle, we have to define what middle we mean, because it could be that the middle is what it is, but it could be that the middle is not what it is. So take for example, in saying it's not what it is, this. Is the good stuff in the middle or what? I mean, look, I love bread. Don't get me wrong. I really like bread. But it's not like a grilled cheese sandwich. The good stuff's in the middle. That gooey cheese that comes out of the middle of the bread is what makes it wonderful. That and the butter on the bread, of course, but that's what makes it great. Any sandwich, peanut butter jelly, ham and cheese, whatever it is that you like, it's what's in the middle of the bread that makes it worthwhile. Now, why do I bring this up? Because I'm about to venture to the middle, just as the apostles were venturing to the middle. And not only that, but I'm about to venture to the middle of the bread, between two slices of bread. So this is really intriguing how John aligns these stories in this case. So you would think that all of these signs, 1 through 7, they fall completely in chronological order, and that they fall through the Gospels in a certain order. And that is true in every other instance. But there is one sign that falls within another. And it's kind of odd. I've always wondered why it was this way, and even after seeing the theological reason for that being the case, I think this series has helped me to define why this little nugget in the middle, right in the middle of the bread, why it is so significant. Now, why do I say in the middle of the bread? John's fourth sign, you could say Jesus' fourth sign, but John's the one that illuminates them as signs. So I'm just saying John's fourth sign, that Jesus is who he is. that the new age is what the new age is, that there is a new reality. John's fourth sign of this is the feeding of the 5,000. And the feeding of the 5,000 is a really important sign. It's likened to the manna in the wilderness. It takes us back to the Passover, which I'll get to in a moment. It is a sign that is of great significance in John's gospel. It ties to the Lord's Supper. There are lots of ties in this story that are really important, and we're going to study it next week. So Jesus feeds the multitudes, and then Jesus explains to the apostles the meaning of the feeding of the multitudes while they're, as we'll see next week, seeking another sign, while they're having really deep discussion with him. But in between those two pieces, the story itself and the conversation about the story, there is this little piece we'll look at today. Now, what's intriguing is that what we have is a statement within a statement. The statements, both of them, involve two little words. I am. In Greek, this is ego eimi. Ego eimi. And not only is it tied to a particular expression of Jesus, but it is like unto the Septuagintal expression of something that happened in the Old Testament. And the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament that people had in Jesus and John's day. What they studied, what they looked at. Because most people in the early church didn't speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek. And so therefore, most of them. And so therefore, the Septuagint was important. So you might remember where we find that in the Old Testament. Do you? Do you? I think this is easy. Like, I think this is a pretty simple one. So, when did God say, I am? And the answer is at the burning bush. So, you remember Moses had killed an Egyptian soldier in order to free a Hebrew slave. And that had forced him away from his home in the Egyptian palace and forced him back to his own people, the Hebrew people, who he'd floated in a basket to, if you'll remember. And it had forced him to identify with the plight of the Hebrew people, their slavery. And so he runs away for fear of his life. He's on the backside of a mountain in the wilderness, and God calls him. And the way God calls him is through a burning bush, but the bush is not consumed, remember? And Moses thinks, this is weird. A bush is on fire, but it's still got its leaves and everything. It's still a bush, as much as you do in the desert. And so Moses goes to see what's going on, and immediately he knows he's on holy ground. So he shakes off his sandals, and he stands in the presence of God at the burning bush. But Moses is afraid. He's afraid of what God is asking him to do, which is to go to his people and then to Pharaoh himself and to say, let my people go. And he's afraid of two things. First of all, he's afraid of what Pharaoh might do. But secondly, and this is his first fear, he's afraid that his people won't follow him. I get this fear. I understand it. Like, after all these years I've been living in the Egyptian palace, even though I found my way to the wilderness the way I did, why would they find me credible? And God says to Moses, just tell them I am. It's a curious thing, but boy, is it powerful. It is that God needs no sustenance from any other. He was before there was time or anything in time, and he will be after there is time or anything that is time. He's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He just is. He always was and always will be. He is. He is whether you believe in him or not. He is whether you say nice things about him or not. He is whether you read the Bible or not. He is whether you worship or not. He is. And what faith is all about is countenancing the reality of his being, of his creative being. So God says to Moses in Exodus 3:14, you tell them I am who I am. Now this is interesting because that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew just says I am. But it's translated to help you understand God is who God is. So we get a little extra verbiage here. Now here's where we come to John's fifth sign. John's fifth sign is the shortest little narrative of all of them. In fact, you'd be tempted to pass it over. You might even decide there's a better story of something similar found like in the Gospel of Mark, for example, where Peter walks on water to Jesus, remember? But this story is so simple. It is so simple. It is just a story of Jesus walking on water to his apostles in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. That's all that this is. And it falls right in the middle of this story of bread. Now, what we need to see is that every one of Jesus' signs gets him to a saying. And every one of those sayings is an I am saying. So you can start looking for the I am sayings in John, but you've already seen a few of them. So the story of the raising of Lazarus brings us to behold his statement to Martha as he encounters her, where he says, you're going to finish the sentence, okay? I am, just want to make sure you listened on Easter. Just want to make sure. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, though they die, yet they'll live. I am the resurrection and the life. That's the heart of the story. It's the crux of the story of the raising of Lazarus. Last week, in my absence, Chris preached about the story of the healing of the blind man, which led Jesus to say, I am. I'm not sure what Chris said. I'm pretty sure he read the Bible, though. So I am. No, not in that story. I am the true light. I am the light. I'm the true light that enlightens every human being. I am the true light. That was the whole point of that story. And when we get to Jesus' feeding of the multitudes next week, which is John's fourth sign, because we're working backwards, when we get to that story, Jesus is going to say, I am, do you know, before we even preach it, I am the bread of life. I'm the bread of life. The one who sups on me will never be hungry again. Each of these happenings, each of these signs of a new reality point to one of these I am statements. But what's curious is that in every instance except the one we'll see today, that ego eimi Greek saying, the I am saying, is modified in some way. I am something. I am the bread of life. I am the true life that enlightens every man. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life, whatever the case may be. Today, not. Just be attuned to that and watch for it, because I've always wondered why, and now I think I know why. I have a conjecture that I think is more accurate than not. Now, here's what you need to see. When we get next week to the story of the feeding of the 5,000, that story will begin by telling us that the Passover is near. Now, whenever we see the Passover mentioned in the context of Jesus' ministry, we should start watching for ways that his ministry recapitulates the Passover, ways that it plays out the drama of the Passover. And that's the case here. See, the feeding of the 5,000 is like manna in the wilderness. And when Jesus walks on water, and the statement, I am, is present like the burning bush, what does Jesus walking on water remind you of in the Passover story? What? How about the Red Sea? The crossing of the Red Sea. The people walked over with Moses and his staff as though on dry land. And Jesus walks on the sea, on the lake of Galilee, as though on dry land. And readers of John's day were reading this, and they knew the story of the Passover, and they were seeing the story of the Passover intertwined with Jesus' story. But I think there's even more here than that. The meat in the sandwich, the peanut butter and jelly in the middle of the bread, the cheese in the middle of the slices, that turns out to be rather significant in and of itself because of the way Jesus makes this statement. Let's just read the story, can we? When evening came, John chapter 6, verse 16. When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now, before I go any further, let me tell you this is a rare occurrence. You go, wait a second. Don't boats go across lakes today without thinking? In Jesus' day, no. Fishermen typically stayed right around the edges. In fact, there were stories of monsters in the deep. They avoided the deep. They were afraid of the deep. They didn't go across the lake. Legend taught them, their mothers taught them, don't go out in the middle of that thing, it can kill you. But with Jesus, the disciples often found themselves scuttling him from one place to another, taking him all the way across the lake. From where they were to Capernaum is right across the middle of the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee. Now, not only were they in a place that was unfamiliar to them, by now it was dark. Now, everybody knows you shouldn't drive when it's dark after a certain age. So by now it was dark, and Jesus wasn't with them. So they were alone, as it were. And then a strong wind was blowing, and waters grew rough. And some of the disciples in the boat said what everybody says when they expect the worst and it happens. They said, "It is what it is," but this is how they say it. "I told you so, Peter." I told you so. That's the same thing as "it is what it is," just in a future form. A strong wind was blowing, the waters grew rough. And when they'd rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. And they were afraid, and they were frightened. But Jesus said to them, "It is I." This is, by the way, not exactly what he said. It's a bad translation of the Greek, but it's necessary for the way most English-speaking people read. "It is I, don't be afraid." Jesus did not tell the apostles not to be afraid. Trust me on this. He did not. But for our reading, we would have a hard time translating what he actually said, until I hope I help you. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. Nice of them. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. So when you get Jesus on board, things go faster. And the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with the disciples, but that they had gone on away alone. And then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks, because I told you this story is tucked or sandwiched within another. And once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and they went to Capernaum, Jesus' hometown at the time, in search of Jesus. Now, how does this story pivot? It pivots on the I am, or ego eimi expression of Jesus. But in order to get there, it pivots on the emotions of the apostles. So when I read this story, here's where I start to grab onto it. Here's where I start to identify with it. Here's where I start to understand it. And that is when I read in Greek the one word that is translated, "they were frightened." It's a form of the word phobos in Greek, and it means they were afraid. Now, the intriguing thing, I think, is that if you read the way John tells the story, you really can't quite tell why they are afraid. Am I right? I mean, you make an assumption, but that assumption is rooted in the time that Jesus' apostles were on the Sea of Galilee and they saw Jesus and feared he was a ghost. Do you remember that? And that's actually in the Synoptics, not in John. And that's the time, you remember, one of those times at least, where Peter walks on water. That's not this story. So I don't think they're afraid of Jesus, to be honest. But maybe they are. Perhaps they are frightened. I mean, they've seen Jesus do these amazing things. And those things, all of them, are altering their understanding of reality. And they're experiencing what we call cognitive dissonance, which is when the reality you now perceive is the different than one that you've always known. And trying to reconcile those two will blow your brains out. It blows your mind. And when that happens, it's frightening. Now, listen, I just don't even have to ask you. Nobody likes change. Some of us are more change ready than others. But nobody likes change except the one who is creating the change. This is something every pastor and leader should remember. I never expect people to immediately accommodate change when I'm leading us into a different place. It's always frightening because it's different than the reality we've known and felt in control of. So in this case, the apostles are having to accommodate an awful lot of change. And Jesus walking on water is just one more sign that things ain't what they thought they were. What they're seeing is that it is not what it is. And that could be frightening to them, okay? But I don't think Jesus himself was frightening. So maybe they're afraid because they're in the middle of the lake where their mamas told them not to go. Maybe they're afraid because the little boat they have, the little fishing boat, is not equipped to traverse the water. Maybe they're afraid a monster might eat them any minute. Maybe that's it. And that probably is part of the equation. Or maybe they're afraid because the winds have picked up and because they start to see whitecaps on the sea. It's dark and now there's a storm. See, I told you so. Maybe they're afraid of the present context or situation. I'd say there's a pretty good chance of that. Ironically, while I was completing these notes this week, I was not in town. I was on the shore of North Carolina. And Debbie and I had a day there that was just hellish. It was amazing. It was a storm like I've rarely seen. And the incredible thing about this storm was it was not only big, but it was like some of the tropical storms that we've seen. I mean, winds blew up from everywhere, 50, 60 mile per hour gusts. And when I looked out at the water, the whitecaps were just unreal. The house was shaking. And we knew, we've been in wind there before. That house has withstood hurricanes. We knew we were going to be okay. But in the course of a game we were playing, Debbie said to me, "Man, this is scary." Because it is. Because when things feel out of control, they're frightening. And in this situation, the storm put them off guard in a different place. Now, here's the thing. They were probably afraid of all of these things, and in a sense, none of them. Because fear is a funny thing. Fear is like a bird that flies around and circles you all the time looking for a place to land. And if you don't find a rational place, it will find an irrational place to light. You need to understand that fear is not external to you, it is only internal. It is not reality, it does not even exist. Fear is not a thing, it is not tangible. It cannot be attacked, it cannot be defended against. Fear is nothing but an emotion. It's a response to the circumstance or the situation. And so my guess is that the apostles are just general purpose afraid like most human beings. And all of these situations, all of them are places that the bird of fear can light and find a nest. Does this happen to you? I can tell you for sure it does. In some of your cases, it happens an awful lot. And you're looking for some place to describe, this is the actual fear thing, and this is some way I could remedy it or fix it. And so you're constantly chasing this fear instead of understanding what it is and what it is not. Because when it comes to fear, fear is not what it is. But the apostles, they were frightened. And they probably would have said something like, fear is what it is. It just comes on you and there's nothing you can do about it. And man, what happens is people around us get afraid. We get afraid too. And there's so much bad stuff happening. We all know it's going to turn out bad. See, I told you so. And we say that fear is what it is. How does Jesus respond? Jesus said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid," in the English. But let me tell you the cool thing. In the Greek, this is the literal translation of the Greek. Jesus says, "I am, fear not." I am, not fear. I am the reality. I am what really is. I am eternity. I am the resurrection and the life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I am the reality. And fear is not the reality. I think this is powerful. It gives me new insight into how to deal with fear when I feel it. When I hear Jesus say, "I am." Not fear. Fear just is not what it is. Now, I thought to sort of help define exactly what fear is when it is. What do we think of when we think of fear? So I don't often do this. I try not to use dictionary definitions in sermons, to be honest with you. But man, this one's so doggone good, I couldn't avoid it. And so I looked up in Merriam-Webster, how would fear be defined in our culture? And this is what Webster says: an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. Now, this is a fascinating definition. The reason it is fascinating is because awareness of danger and anticipation of danger are not the same thing. There is a moment to be afraid, okay? Awareness of danger. If somebody walks in right now with a weapon, I will rightly be afraid. Sorry to even make you think of that. If I'm being chased by a wild animal, I'm right to be afraid. It's a good idea to run, usually. Not always the right response. Sometimes, if a hurricane is coming and I'm told to evacuate, it's a good idea to use fear well and to get out of the way. The problem is, friends, and this has been proven and written about so much that I don't even need to go into great detail, your reptile brain and my little reptile brain cannot distinguish the difference between awareness and anticipation of danger. They are the same thing in our minds. Exactly. What we imagine is as real when it comes to fear as what is. What we anticipate or expect is as real in our brains as what is. And this is dangerous for me because I am a story finisher. Do you know what a story finisher is? Do you know? A story finisher is someone who makes up the end of the story before it actually happens. So you get into the middle of the situation and you finish the story. I do this in relationships. I do it relative to our church. I do it relative to world events. I do it all the time. And the ends of my story are always horrible. Something bad always happens, which gives me the illusion of control. Because when we have anticipated the worst and expected to accommodate the worst and tried to remove ourselves from the situation, we feel in control when really we are not in control of the future. So what happens is I'll finish the story and the horrifying end will cause me to act in ways that are rather irrational. The problem is that my ends are not usually correct. Once in a while they are, but usually they're not. So most things that I fear never actually come to pass. Any amens out there, or I'm the only one? They never actually come to pass. Or if they do come to pass, I'm more equipped to deal with them when I get there, or they play out a little differently than I thought they would. But the story's always slightly different than I thought it would be. Now, there's danger in anticipating something and becoming afraid of it. And the danger is that you will react as though the thing already exists. And so you will make your fears a reality. Very often you'll cause those things to come to pass instead of the future of hope that God wants to give to you. And it is a form of trusting your own intuition and instincts more than you trust God. And that is a dangerous thing for us. Now, look, I've been afraid a lot of times in my life. I still get afraid sometimes. People ask me all the time, are you afraid to speak? Never. This worries me not even a little. It causes me to lose no sleep. It excites me and energizes me. I enjoy this, and I don't feel the least little bit of fear about this, which is hard for many of you to remember. But I fear things that you don't. And what I really fear is when I can't be in control of a situation. Remember me telling you I'm a firstborn child? That really scares me. So the two times I've been most afraid in my entire life both have to do with illnesses of people that I love. The first time is when my daughter experienced a severe illness at 9 years old. She's here, so I won't go into great detail about that because it's traumatic for her and for us. But man, I will tell you this, you have not known fear until you have watched people you do not know at all rolling your child away from you and into an operating room. I didn't know a single nurse or doctor. It was an emergency situation. I didn't know anyone. And when that happened, as Debbie will tell you, this is the God's truth, we took turns collapsing. Like she'd be disheveled and I'd be together, and then I'd be disheveled and she'd be together, and this was my disheveled moment. Right after that happened, I was brave and strong until that moment. And that moment, I literally curled up in a corner under a table while my whole family was in the room. I didn't want to talk to anybody. And my dad, trying to be helpful, he came over and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, what are you really afraid of?" And I didn't even know. I was afraid my child might die. I was afraid she might be debilitated in some way. I just said, I don't know. But whatever it is, he said, what is it? Whatever it is, it's going to be terrible. Now, I was finishing the story. Now, please don't get me wrong. It was a terrible situation. But the outcome was nothing like I imagined. And the trauma I dealt with for a year or so thereafter and had to talk through with people was overwhelming to me, because once I had decided that that's how the story was going to work out, I had a hard time changing the story even as the story moved on. That's what trauma is. The body keeps a score, if any of you read that book, which is magnificent. So I couldn't accommodate a better reality because I anticipated the worst reality just in case it happened. Then at least I could say, see, I told you so, and feel like I was in control. The other thing that is more recent is a decade ago when Debbie was diagnosed with a neurological disease. And she didn't want everybody to know immediately. Debbie's a very private person, and she should be allowed to be. And as you know, pastors don't get to be very private. And so Jesus said, honey, I think right now just let me share this in my time. I said, sure, honey, it's your story. But it was my story too, and it was frightening to me, overwhelmingly frightened. Debbie took a little trip, and I read an article. The problem with today is that you can get as much information as you want. And I read an article, and the article essentially said about this particular diagnosis, well, you got 5 or 6 good years. And I started clicking that clock in my mind. I started counting down and ticking it off and finishing the story. Now, that was a decade ago. And while, don't get me wrong, this still isn't fun and lovely, it's not what I thought it was. It's not what it is. And part of the reason it's not what it is because Debbie decided it wouldn't be what it is. She just said, look, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to continue to beat you in pickleball. I'm going to continue to live our life. And here's what I learned from this. But it took me a while. I mean, the first few years were excruciating, and fear kept landing in irrational places and coming out in weird ways. And what I learned is you have to live the day. Now, notice what I said. Don't live for the day. That's a mistake. Live for eternity. But live the day. Wake up in the morning saying, this is the day the Lord has made, and I'll rejoice and be glad in it and experience what that day brings to you without worrying about the future, because you can't control it anyway. All you can do is trust God for it. This is why Jesus said, let the day's worries be sufficient for the day. I've got the future covered, in essence. Now, all of that is to say that you need to figure out whether you are actually aware of danger, or most of the time, I think you'll discover, anticipatory fear, anticipating danger. So let me illustrate a truth that came to me recently by telling you about a conversation that I had. And I'd like to say that I arrived at this years ago, but I didn't. So I was out working in my yard, which I enjoyed doing. But I had a lot to do that particular day. And I was in the mode, just getting the job done. And at this particular time, I was mowing. And so I had earmuffs on my head, and I'm mowing, and I pass my unbelieving neighbor who I've had many conversations with, and he's on the other side of the fence. And he waves at me with one of those waves that says this is more than just saying hi. He goes, and I did what you did when you don't want to talk to someone who's doing that. I went, right? And he goes, hey! Hey! Now, what do I do now? I can pretend I don't hear it, but I do. And so I stop the mower, and I pull off my earmuffs, and I walk over to the fence, and we talk for a couple of hours, and I don't get the rest of my yard work done. Now, this guy's always asking me questions about faith because he thinks I'm weird because I'm a preacher. And so but he does it in nuanced ways. He never comes right out and say, like, could you tell me about Jesus? Could you tell me about faith? Could you tell me about church? Could you tell me about the doctrine of the Holy? He never does that. It's always some nuanced question. So he starts talking to me about trout fishing, which is something I know a little something about. And he starts talking to me about that. And then we get to this thing, and he's telling me about this anticipatory fear he's got about something off in the future. And so, I said, let me tell you my story at this point. And I tell him what I just told you. And I tell them, I think you just have to learn to live the day. And it took me a lot of years to learn this. And like, this is one of those things I wish I'd known a long time ago. So for what it's worth, just live the day. There's so much in your life that's good. Just try to live the day. And in my case, trust God with the day. And he says to me, Jim, I'm going to tell you something. Just because you're worried about something that might happen doesn't mean it won't happen. Just because you're worried about something doesn't mean it won't happen. Which is kind of like saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not out to get you. And I say to him, you've got a point. I mean, I'm sure that everything you're saying in finishing that story could happen. So let's assume that. Let's just assume you're right and the worst is going to happen. But I said, here's the thing, you don't know that. You don't know what's going to happen. So why sell out to what you don't yet know? And I said to him, look, here's what I think. My life posture that I seek but don't always find is faith. And I said, here's what faith does. Faith assumes a future of hope. Amen? Faith assumes God's got it in control. Faith assumes all things work together for good for them who love him and are called according to his purpose, Paul says in Romans. Faith assumes that. Even if death is coming, faith still assumes an eternity of nothing but hope and love. So I said, it strikes me that fear and faith are two choices we make about how to face the future. But they're really the same thing. If you're afraid, you anticipate the worst. And if you have faith, you anticipate the ultimate best. God's ultimate best, no matter what happens. And he says to me, so you're saying to me that if you have faith, you don't have fear. Now, that stopped me in my tracks for a second. And I stopped and I said, nope, that's not what I'm saying. I said, see, here's the thing. Everyone's going to be afraid sometimes. Everyone. So I said, no, I think faith is the response to fear if you know my Lord Jesus and you believe in God. Faith's the way you respond to fear. So it's choosing in the moment you're afraid not to finish the story and not to decide that the future is horrible. And not to decide that the worst possible thing's going to happen. And not to decide that you can't handle whatever's coming. And not to decide that God can't handle whatever's coming. Faith is deciding, I will turn around and say, whatever God has for me is the best there can possibly be for me. Whatever God has for my future is the most hopeful future there can possibly be. Faith is the response to fear. But listen to how that response works. What did Jesus say to the apostles? I am. I'm the reality, not fear. Now, this strikes me suddenly as interesting. In no other place in John does Jesus not modify ego eimi. I am the bread of life. I am the shepherd of the sheep. I am whatever. In this case, Jesus does not modify. Why not? Why does he just say, ego eimi, I am, not fear? And I think the answer is that Jesus' very presence is the only true antidote to fear. Because you can't know the future, and because you don't even know what to ask for. Do you understand what I mean by this? How many times are we even praying rightly about what might happen in the future, but I'm constantly doing it like, Lord, make this happen. Because this is what I think would be best. Thank God he didn't answer my prayers half the time. Because what he had planned was better, or what I needed to learn was more important. Thank God he didn't always answer my prayers. But the right prayer is not that I should say, Lord, give me courage, or Lord, change the circumstance, or Lord, whatever. It is, Lord, be with me. Jesus, be present with me. Walk in me, walk through me, walk beside me, hold my hand. Show me the one next right step. That's all. And I'll trust you for the one after that. Just one step, Lord. That's all I ask. Just one. When you stop praying for 10 steps, you stop finishing the story. And then guess what? God has amazing things to show you, but you've got to allow him to. Even in the most difficult circumstances, you've got to say, I choose faith as a response to fear. Yes, I'm afraid. All people are afraid. So what? The problem is when I sell out to fear, I start to act out of fear, and I make all my fears come true. What could be a greater tool of Satan than fear? I ask you. What could be a greater tool of Satan than fear? Of course I'm afraid. All the time. I just choose to walk anyway. I just choose faith because what else is there but to trust the God of the future who's already there? Jesus says, I am. Not fear. Fear's not real. It's not real. It's just an emotion inside of me. But Jesus is real. He's real. Fear is not what it is. Isn't this what the Apostle Paul probably meant when in 2 Corinthians 4 he writes, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, just the condition of the moment, but what is unseen is eternal. We live by faith, not by sight. Isn't this what he means? Isn't what the author of Hebrews means that fear is not fear when he says this? Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for. That's faith. Faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's assurance about things we do not yet see. So next time you say it is what it is relative to something that really frightens you, I would suggest that you remember it's not what it is. Fear is what it is? No, fear is not what it is. It is not real. It is not true. It is a lie when it is anticipation of things that could possibly not work out. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says it this way. Maybe you know her, maybe you don't. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross she's probably the greatest researcher on grief in the history of the world, I suppose. Until she researched it, I'm not sure anybody really did. And she's a psychiatrist, and she writes a little book that most people don't know. Most of the one they know is on grief, but she writes a little book that I think is much better called Life Lessons. And in that little book, this is what she says. She says, there are only two emotions, love and fear. All positive emotions come from love. All negative emotions from fear. From love flows happiness, contentment, peace, and joy. From fear comes anger, hate, anxiety, and guilt. She continues, it's true. There are only two primary emotions, love and fear. But it's more accurate to say that there is only love or fear because we cannot feel these two emotions together at exactly the same time. They're opposites. If we're in fear, then we're not in a place of love. When we're in a place of love, we cannot be in a place of fear. The same author who wrote the Gospel of John, very same, also wrote an epistle, 1 John, in which he said this, 1 John chapter 4, 16 through 18, God is love. See that? I am. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them, and this is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. Do you see his remedy? It's Christ. It's the presence of Jesus in us, around us, through us, in the midst of us. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Followers of Jesus are seeking to be perfected in love, in Christ's love, amen? So if you're like me, Oh, if you're like me and you worry about everything in the middle. And at the end, if you tend to finish the story and to anticipate the worst possible outcomes, and if that makes you anxious and afraid, perhaps you need to hear with me the words of Jesus. I am, not fear. I am, not fear. I am, not fear. So, Father, we seek to live in your presence through Christ your Son in such a powerful way that our response to the fear every human being sometimes experiences is the faithful response of expectant hope. And Lord, we are seeking as disciples of your Son Jesus to be perfected in his love. Might it be possible that the more we grow, the more what we say and what we think and what we do would be shaped entirely by the love of your Son Jesus, your love shown through him. Father, help us to anticipate nothing but this, that you seek that all things should work for good in the lives of those who love you and are called according to your purpose. The world around us is very afraid right now. We choose faith in Jesus, and in whose name we pray. Amen. Watch a couple of announcements before you go.